The dust was a living thing in the American West. It choked the air, coated the skin in a fine, gritty film, and clung to every surface of the expansive double-bar ranch. For Josiah Caldwell, the ranch owner, it was a constant, suffocating reminder of his life's two greatest struggles: the land he fought daily to tame, and the silent, impenetrable darkness that had consumed his wife, Eleanor. The year was 1888, a time when the promise of the frontier was as harsh as it was beautiful. Josiah was a self-made man, a titan of the cattle industry, who had built his empire from a single horse and a fierce resolve. At 45, his face was a map of hard-won battles, etched with sun-weathered lines and a perpetual scowl. But his success meant nothing. For the past 3 years, a rare, debilitating illness had slowly, mercilessly stolen Eleanor's sight, plunging her into a world of perpetual night. Her name, Eleanor, was a cruel irony. She was the light of his life, a woman of grace and quiet strength. Now she was a prisoner in their sprawling ranch house, a ghost in her own home. The doctors, city-trained and full of empty promises, had come and gone, their remedies proving useless. "It's a degenerative condition, Mr. Caldwell," one had said, his voice dripping with condescension. "There is nothing to be done." The words had felt like a death sentence. Josiah found himself consumed by a helpless rage. He ruled his ranch with an iron fist, his commands met with unquestioning obedience from his dozens of ranch hands. He could move mountains of cattle, negotiate deals that spanned states, and face down any man who dared to challenge him. But he was powerless against a sickness that hid within his own home, a thief stealing the one person he truly loved. He was in the stables, the scent of hay and horse sweat thick in the air, when the new ranch hand, a young man named Silas, approached him. Silas was fresh out of Missouri, green behind the ears, and full of misguided pity. "Mr. Caldwell," he started hesitantly. "I heard about Mrs. Caldwell. Is it true? She can't see a thing." Josiah turned slowly, his eyes narrowing to slits. He didn't tolerate gossip or pity. "Mind your own business, Silas," he growled, the words a low rumble in his chest. Silas flinched but held his ground, his gaze fixed on Josiah's. "I'm sorry, sir. It's just, back in Missouri, I knew a woman who went blind. Folks said a healer from the reservation helped her. An old man, a medicine man." The words hit Josiah like a physical blow. He scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Superstition and nonsense," he spat. "I've had the best doctors from Chicago and Denver look at her. They know things those savages don't." He turned his back on Silas, dismissing the boy and his foolish talk. But the words healer and reservation echoed in his mind, a faint, unwanted whisper of hope. He had long held a deep-seated distrust of the Native American tribes, a prejudice born from the land wars and violent conflicts that had marked his youth. To seek help from them, from an Apache, was a betrayal of everything he stood for. He walked toward the main house, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and red, painting the sky with a desperate beauty. The house, once a beacon of his success, now felt like a mausoleum. He pushed open the heavy oak door and found Eleanor in the parlor, her slender fingers tracing the embroidered patterns of a tablecloth she could no longer see. Her hair, a cascade of silver and wheat, was pulled back in a simple bun, and her face, once vibrant, was now pale and gaunt. "Josiah?" she asked, her voice soft and fragile. She couldn't see him, but she could sense his presence. He knelt beside her, his large, calloused hand gently covering hers. "I'm here, my love." "It's getting harder, Josiah," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "The world is so quiet now, and so dark." A tear, hot and defiant, slipped from his eye and rolled down his cheek, a traitorous display of the helplessness he felt. He had to do something, anything, even if it meant swallowing his pride and seeking a solution he didn't believe in. For Eleanor, he would walk through fire. For Eleanor, he would face the very people he had learned to despise. He stood up, his jaw set in a line of grim determination. He wouldn't tell her of his plan, not yet. He wouldn't offer false hope. He would ride out tomorrow, a rich rancher on a desperate quest, willing to do the unthinkable. His destination was the arid, unforgiving landscape of the Apache reservation, a place he had always viewed as the land of his enemies. He would find a healer, a medicine man, and he would pay any price to bring the light back to his wife's eyes. The dust outside was settling, but a new storm was brewing inside Josiah's heart. The next morning, under a sky the color of washed-out denim, Josiah rode out from the double-bar ranch. He left without a word, his destination a secret kept even from his most trusted foreman. The journey was long and arduous, the sun beating down with a relentless fury, and the landscape changing from the familiar grassy plains to the craggy, sun-baked desert of the Arizona Territory. He rode for 2 days, his thoughts a tangled mess of hope and skepticism. The sheer audacity of his mission, a rich white man seeking a miracle from the very people his world had systematically pushed aside, weighed on him. The tension in the air thickened the closer he got to the reservation. This wasn't a town where he could simply ride up to a store. This was Apache land, a place where a man like him was viewed with suspicion, if not outright hostility. He finally crested a small ridge and saw it, a scattering of small dome-shaped wickiups made of brush and hide, half hidden among the mesquite and yucca. The air was still, heavy with a silence that felt older than time itself. He saw a few figures in the distance, but no one approached. He was an intruder, a lone sentinel on the edge of a world he did not understand. Josiah dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry ground. His horse, a sturdy bay mare, snorted and pawed the dirt nervously. He stood there for a long time, the weight of his Stetson hat a heavy burden on his head. He was a man accustomed to taking charge, to giving orders. But here he was an outsider, his wealth and power rendered meaningless. It was then he saw the boy. He was young, maybe 11 or 12, with dark, observant eyes and a face that was both serious and wise beyond his years. He was sitting on a flat rock, meticulously shaping a piece of wood with a small, sharp knife. His clothes were worn but clean, a simple buckskin shirt and leggings. He didn't look at Josiah directly, but the rancher knew the boy was aware of his presence. After a few moments, the boy finally looked up, his gaze steady and unwavering. He held the knife loosely in his hand. "Are you lost, sir?" the boy asked in surprisingly clear English, his voice a quiet, melodic sound against the backdrop of the desert wind. Josiah was taken aback. He had expected a language barrier, a cold indifference, but not this. "No, I'm not lost." He hesitated, the words feeling clumsy and thick in his mouth. "I'm looking for a healer, a medicine man." The boy's expression remained impassive, but Josiah could see a flicker of something in his eyes, a guarded curiosity. "What ails you?" he asked. "It's not for me," Josiah said, his voice dropping, the harshness from the ranch replaced by a raw vulnerability. "It's my wife. She went blind. The doctors, they said there's nothing to be done." The boy's gaze drifted past Josiah toward the horizon, as if he were seeing something far away. He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the faint whisper of the wind through the dry grass. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "I can heal your blind wife," he said, the words a strange, almost surreal echo of the title that had brought Josiah here. Josiah stared at him, a sudden jolt of disbelief and hope coursing through him. He had expected an elder, a man with a lifetime of knowledge, not a child. "You?" he asked, a trace of his old skepticism creeping back into his voice. "You're a boy." "My grandfather is a healer," the boy explained simply, "but he is old and his hands are not as steady as they once were. He has taught me. He says a true healer must have not only knowledge, but a pure heart and an open mind." The words pure heart and open mind resonated with a profound irony for Josiah. His own heart felt calloused, his mind rigid with a lifetime of prejudice, but the boy's conviction was undeniable. It was not a boast, but a simple statement of fact. "What is your name?" Josiah asked, a quiet respect entering his voice. "Nahimana," the boy replied. "It means the one who brings light." Josiah's breath caught in his throat. The name was another impossible coincidence, a sign he couldn't ignore. He looked at the boy, Nahimana, and saw not a threat, but a fragile thread of hope. The world he knew had told him to despise this boy and his people, but his heart, in its desperation, was telling him to trust. He had come here with an open hand, offering to pay a price. Now, he felt the cost might be something far greater than money. It might be the very foundation of his beliefs. Nahimana, Josiah said, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. Will you come with me? The boy looked past him again, his eyes scanning the horizon, a silent conversation with the wind and the land. He gave a single slow nod. I will come. The journey back was different. The silence that had felt so heavy on the way in was now filled with the unspoken weight of a fragile pact. Josiah rode with the Apache boy, a living embodiment of the clash between two worlds. He knew he was bringing a storm back to his ranch, and he had no idea if it would heal or destroy everything he had built. All he knew was that he was placing his faith in the whisper of a boy named Nahimana, the one who brings light. The journey back to the Double Bar Ranch was a study in silence and observation. Nahimana rode a small, sturdy pony that seemed to appear from nowhere, a gift from his people that he accepted without a word. He rode a few paces behind Josiah, his presence a constant, unnerving weight. He did not speak unless spoken to, and when he did, his words were few and precise. Josiah found himself stealing glances at the boy. He was thin, wiry, with a kind of quiet strength that was almost unsettling. He moved with a grace that seemed more at home on the land than on a horse. The rancher, a man used to the boisterous, loud nature of his own men, found the boy's stillness profoundly alien. The closer they got to the ranch, the more Josiah's anxiety mounted. He had left in a fit of desperate hope, but now, with the reality of bringing an Apache boy into his meticulously ordered world looming, he felt a wave of doubt. What would the ranch hands say? What would Eleanor think? He had always kept his prejudices private, a part of him that was as ingrained as the calluses on his hands. Now he was bringing that very prejudice to a head, forcing it into the light. As the outline of the ranch came into view, the sprawling white house, the cluster of barns and corrals, the vast, fenced-in pastures, Nahimana finally broke his silence. "You are a rich man," he stated, his voice devoid of judgment. It was a simple observation, like noting the color of the sky. Josiah grunted in response. "I have worked hard for it." "The land gives you its bounty," Nahimana said, his eyes scanning the endless fields of cattle. "But it is not a part of you." The word struck Josiah with an uncomfortable truth. He owned the land, but he had never felt a part of it. He had always been a master, a dominator, bending it to his will. The Apache boy's observation was so simple, yet it cut to the very core of his existence. When they rode into the ranch yard, the effect was immediate. The ranch hands lounging by the stables fell silent. They stared, their expressions a mix of confusion and open hostility. An Apache, a boy no less, on the Caldwell Ranch. It was unheard of. Their whispers, low and venomous, followed Josiah and Nahimana as they dismounted. Josiah ignored them, his jaw set. He led Nahimana to the main house, the tension in the air a palpable force. He opened the parlor door and saw Eleanor in her usual chair, her fingers running over the keys of a piano she could no longer play. The piano's silent presence was a symbol of everything they had lost. "Eleanor," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "I have someone I want you to meet." She turned her head, her sightless eyes fixed on some point in the distance. She couldn't see the boy, but she could feel the change in the room's atmosphere. "Josiah? Who is it?" "It's a young man, a healer." He stumbled over the word. Nahimana stepped forward, his small moccasin-clad feet making no sound on the polished wood floor. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, his presence a quiet, calming force. He didn't rush, didn't make a sound. He simply existed. Eleanor, despite her blindness, felt it. She tilted her head, a soft, inquisitive look on her face. "He's very quiet," she said, her voice filled with a kind of gentle curiosity. "Hello?" "Greetings, madam," Nahimana said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. Eleanor's face broke into a fragile smile. "Hello, Josiah. What is his name?" "Nahimana," Josiah said, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of hope and fear. Nahimana knelt beside her chair, his movements fluid and natural. He reached out a hand and without touching her, he held it a few inches from her face. Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply sat there, a silent statue, while the boy's hand hovered, a strange, electric tension filling the air. "The darkness is thick," Nahimana said, his voice low and serious. "It is not a sickness of the body alone. It is a sickness of the spirit, too." Eleanor's smile faltered, replaced by a look of profound understanding. "I know," she whispered. "It is a heavy thing." Josiah stood in the doorway, a mute observer. The conversation was strange, abstract, unlike anything he had ever heard from the doctors. It was not a clinical assessment, but something deeper, something that spoke to the soul. He had brought Nahimana here for a cure, a physical remedy, but he was starting to realize that the boy's work was something far more profound. He was a healer not just of the body but of the spirit, and in this quiet moment, the first fragile seeds of that promise were being sown. The ranch, the dust, the men's whispers, it all faded away. There was only the boy, the woman, and the strange, unspoken promise of light. The next morning, the air in the ranch house was heavy with an unspoken tension. Josiah had sent the ranch hands on a long cattle drive to the northern pastures, a clear message that he wanted no one interfering with his family's business. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. Nahimana rose with the sun. He did not eat the bacon and eggs prepared for him by the cook. Instead, he went outside and walked to the edge of the sprawling ranch property. Josiah watched him from a distance, a silent, cautious sentinel. The boy knelt in the dusty soil, his fingers sifting through the earth. He found a small, smooth river stone, a piece of bleached bone, and a handful of dried herbs. He placed them carefully in a small buckskin pouch he carried at his waist. Josiah found him later by the creek that ran through the property, his eyes closed in what appeared to be meditation. The boy was a stark contrast to his surroundings, a small, still point of quiet in a world built on noise and constant motion. When Nahimana returned to the house, he went directly to the parlor where Eleanor was waiting. She was sitting in the same chair as before, her hands resting in her lap. Josiah was there too, standing by the fireplace, his posture rigid. Nahimana did not speak to Josiah. He went to Eleanor, knelt before her, and opened his small pouch. He laid the river stone on her hand. Her fingers, which had been tense, slowly relaxed around the cold, smooth rock. "This stone has been here for a long time," Nahimana said, his voice soft and calming. "It has seen the sun and the rain. It has seen the seasons change. It has seen the world as it is." Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile. She lifted the stone, bringing it closer to her face as if to see it. Of course she could not, but the gesture was one of acceptance, not of a test. Next, Nahimana took the dried herbs and placed them on a small clay bowl. He lit them with a single match, and a thin, fragrant wisp of smoke curled into the air. The scent was clean and earthy, nothing like the sweet, cloying remedies the doctors had used. "This is the scent of the earth," Nahimana explained. "It speaks of healing and new beginnings." Eleanor inhaled deeply, a long, shaky breath. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "What is it?" "Sage and cedar," Nahimana replied. "They cleanse the spirit." Josiah watched, his skepticism warring with a strange, burgeoning sense of peace. There was no scientific explanation for any of this. It was ritual, superstition. Yet the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The air no longer felt heavy with despair. There was a lightness, a sense of possibility. Nahimana then took the small piece of bone, a fragment bleached by the sun. He gently traced the bone over Eleanor's closed eyelids, a touch so light she barely seemed to notice. "This is the bone of a deer," he said, his voice a steady murmur. "The deer sees with clarity even when it runs through the trees. Its sight is not in its eyes, but in its heart." The words were a metaphor, a poetic plea to a spirit he could not see. But Eleanor seemed to understand. A single tear, the first Josiah had seen her shed in months, traced a path down her pale cheek. It was not a tear of sadness, but of release. Finally, Nahimana took a small gourd filled with a clear liquid. He dipped his fingers in it and gently touched Eleanor's eyelids, forehead, and temples. The liquid was cool and had a subtle, earthy smell. "This is water from the creek," he explained. "It has the strength of the mountains and the patience of the desert. It will remind your spirit what it is to see the world as it truly is." The first ritual was complete. Nahimana sat back on his heels, his work done for the day. He gave no promises, offered no time frame. He simply looked at Josiah, his dark eyes meeting the rancher's. In that look, Josiah saw a profound understanding. The boy knew that this was not a quick fix, a magical cure. It was a journey, a long, slow process of healing that had to start not with the body but with the broken spirit. Josiah, who had come looking for a miracle, was starting to understand that what he was witnessing was something far more difficult and perhaps far more real. He had to trust this boy, this child of the land, with the most precious thing in his life. And in the quiet of the parlor, with the scent of sage and cedar still lingering in the air, he found that he was willing to do so. The healing had begun, not just for Eleanor but for him as well. The presence of Nahimana on the Caldwell Ranch was a constant source of friction. The ranch hands, who had returned from their long cattle drive, eyed the boy with a mix of suspicion and open animosity. He was a symbol of everything they had been taught to despise, a Native American, a reminder of the long and bloody conflicts that had defined the West. Whispers followed Nahimana wherever he went. "Caldwell's gone soft," one man, a grizzled foreman named Hank, grumbled to the others. "Bringing a savage onto his own land, what's next? Letting them take our cattle?" The words were like poison, spreading a slow, toxic resentment among the men. They found 1,000 ways to show their displeasure. A thrown rock when the boy wasn't looking, a scowl or a muttered insult under their breath. They were all afraid of Josiah, but their hatred for Nahimana was stronger than their fear. Nahimana, for his part, seemed oblivious to their hostility. He moved through the ranch like a ghost, his head held high, his movements silent and purposeful. He spent his days in the hills and by the creek, gathering herbs and materials for his rituals. He never seemed to notice the glares, the muttered threats, or if he did, he gave no sign. This stoic indifference only seemed to infuriate the men more. Josiah was a man caught in the middle. He had built his world on a foundation of control and authority. Now, his authority was being tested by his own men, and the source of that conflict was a child. He tried to ignore it, to pretend the problem didn't exist. He had brought the boy here for Eleanor, and that was all that mattered. One afternoon he found Nahimana by the corral, sitting on the fence post watching the horses. Hank, the foreman, was on the other side, his face a mask of contempt. "What's the matter, boy?" Hank sneered. "Lost your way back to your people?" Nahimana didn't respond. He simply watched a young colt frolic in the dust. Hank took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "You don't belong here, kid. You and your kind. This is our land. We took it from you, and we'll be damned if we let you back on it." Still, Nahimana did not flinch. He did not rise to the bait. His silence was a wall Hank could not penetrate, and it only served to make the foreman more enraged. "I'm talking to you, boy," Hank bellowed, his fist clenching. It was then that Josiah stepped out from the shadows of the stable. "Hank," he said, his voice as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "What is the meaning of this?" Hank's face paled. He straightened up, his bravado instantly replaced by a feigned deference. "Just talking to the boy, Mr. Caldwell. Nothing to worry about." "I see what you're doing," Josiah said, his voice low and dangerous. "I brought him here. He is under my protection. Any man who has a problem with that can pack his bags and leave now. Is that clear?" Hank swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, sir. Clear as day." He retreated, his eyes still burning with a frustrated rage. Josiah turned to Nahimana, the tension in his shoulders finally starting to release. "You should have told me," Josiah said, his voice gruff but filled with a strange, reluctant gratitude. Nahimana looked at him, his dark eyes holding a deep, ancient understanding. "Words are not always necessary," he said. "The wind speaks, the sun speaks, the earth speaks, Their language is the one that matters. Josiah had no answer for that. He was a man of action, of direct confrontation. The boy's passive resistance was a foreign concept to him, yet it was surprisingly effective. He was defending the boy, not because he believed in him, but because he was a tool, a means to an end. But in that moment, as he watched Nahimana walk away, a new feeling stirred within him. It was a sense of responsibility, not just for the boy's safety, but for the man he was becoming. He was learning to see, not with his eyes, but with his heart, just as Nahimana had said. The days settled into a quiet rhythm on the ranch, a strange peace that was constantly on the verge of shattering. Nahimana continued his daily rituals with Eleanor. The sessions were simple and consisted of a mix of traditional Apache healing practices and a quiet, patient conversation. He would bring her different objects from the land: a smooth grey stone he found by the creek, a feather from a hawk, a twisted root from a mesquite tree. He would describe them to her, not in a clinical way, but with a vivid, poetic language that painted pictures in her mind. "This stone," he would say, holding it to her hand, "is grey like the clouds before the storm. It has a tiny river running through it, a path for the rain." Eleanor, who had spent 3 years in a world of total darkness, began to respond. She would listen intently, her face a mask of profound concentration, and then she would describe what she felt. "It's smooth but with a rough patch right here," she said one day, her fingers tracing a small imperfection on a piece of polished wood, like a man's thumb. Nahimana smiled, a rare and fleeting expression that transformed his serious face. "That's a good heart," he said. "It has seen many things, but it is not afraid to show its marks." Their connection deepened. Eleanor found herself talking to the boy about things she hadn't spoken of in years: the light in her garden, the color of her favorite dress, the way the sun felt on her face in the morning. She was not just recalling memories, she was reliving them, her spirit awakening from its long slumber. Josiah watched it all from a distance, a silent, cautious observer. He saw the change in Eleanor, a subtle but undeniable shift. The lines of despair on her face were softening. The fragile smile that had once been so rare was now a more frequent occurrence. She was still blind, but she was no longer a ghost in her own home. She was alive. One afternoon, Josiah found Nahimana and Eleanor in the parlor. Nahimana had brought a small earthenware pot filled with a fragrant mixture of herbs and soil. He had her cup her hands over it, inhaling the earthy aroma. "What is that, my love?" Josiah asked, his voice low. "It's the smell of the land after a long rain, Josiah," Eleanor said, her voice filled with a quiet joy. "He told me." Nahimana didn't speak, his eyes on Eleanor's face. He then had her place her hands on a small blanket. He covered her hands with the warm, earthy mixture. "The earth is a healer," he said to her. "It is the beginning of all things. It reminds us of where we came from and where we are going." As Eleanor sat with her hands covered, a strange calm filled the room. The dust outside, the whispers of the men, the fear and the desperation, it all seemed to vanish. There was only the sound of the wind, the scent of the earth, and the quiet presence of the boy and the woman. Later that evening, after Nahimana had retired, Josiah sat with Eleanor by the fire. He took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "How are you feeling, my love?" he asked. "Lighter," she said, her voice a soft murmur. "The world feels less heavy and less dark." Her small, fragile spark of hope ignited in Josiah's chest. It was not a magical cure, not a sudden restoration of sight. It was a small victory, a triumph of the spirit. The boy's methods were unorthodox, unscientific, but they were working. They were bringing his wife back to him, one small, precious piece at a time. The boy wasn't a doctor, he was a caretaker, a guide. And Josiah, a man who had built his life on logic and reason, was starting to understand that some things, the most important things, could not be explained by a doctor's chart or a scientific theory. They were simply felt. In the quiet of the night, with the woman he loved by his side, Josiah began to believe. The small victories, however, did not go unnoticed. The change in Eleanor was undeniable. Her steps were surer, her laughter more frequent, her voice filled with a new kind of vitality. This change only served to fuel the resentment among some of the ranch hands, particularly Hank, the foreman. He saw the boy's presence as an insult, a black stain on the Caldwell name. Hank, a man who had served Josiah for years, considered himself a true confidant. He believed he was protecting his boss from a charlatan, a savage who was filling the kind woman's head with nonsense. He approached Josiah one evening, his face a mask of forced sincerity. "Mr. Caldwell," he began, hat in hand, "begging your pardon, but I feel I must speak my mind. That boy, he's a fraud, filling Mrs. Caldwell with false hope. It ain't right." Josiah's gaze was hard, his voice low. "He is doing what a dozen doctors couldn't, Hank. He's bringing her peace." "Peace?" Hank scoffed, a venomous edge to his voice. "Sir, you're blinded by hope. You're a smart man. You know his rituals are just smoke and mirrors. He's an Apache. He's here for a reason, and it ain't to help us. He's looking to find an opening, to get a foothold." The word struck a chord of fear in Josiah. His old prejudices, the very ones he was trying to suppress, reared their ugly heads. He knew the history of their conflicts. He knew the mistrust ran deep. Was Hank right? Was he so desperate that he had been duped? That night, Josiah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The fear was a cold, bitter taste in his mouth. He had given his trust to a boy, an Apache, a member of a tribe his people had fought and killed for generations. Was he a fool? Was he jeopardizing his ranch, his legacy, and most importantly, his wife's well-being for a pipe dream? The next day, he watched Nahimana with a new, critical eye. The boy was the same as always, quiet, observant, and patient. He brought Eleanor a small white flower he had found blooming by the creek. "This flower," he said, holding it to her nose, "grows in the most difficult places. It does not need much water. It is a sign of strength." Eleanor smiled, her fingers gently touching the soft petals. "It smells so beautiful," she said. Josiah watched, his mind racing. Was this a trick? A simple gesture to win their trust? He had to know. He had to test the boy. He went to the stable and found Silas, the young ranch hand who had first spoken of the Apache healers. "Silas," Josiah said, his voice flat, "I need you to tell me the truth. You said you knew a woman who was healed. How?" Silas, looking terrified, stammered, "Mr. Caldwell, I just heard stories. I don't know if it's true. Just talk." Josiah's heart sank. He had based his entire desperate journey on talk, on a baseless rumor. He turned on his heel and walked away, the rage and frustration boiling inside him. He had been a fool. Hank had been right. He found Nahimana later, sitting on a rock by the stream, his eyes closed. He looked so small, so young. The innocence of his face was a powerful weapon. "Boy," Josiah said, his voice hard, "tell me the truth. This healing, is it real? Or are you just playing a game with my wife?" Nahimana opened his eyes slowly, his gaze calm and unwavering. "What is real, sir?" he asked, his voice soft. "The sight of the eye is one thing. The sight of the spirit is another. The doctors, they see only the body. I see the spirit. Your wife's spirit was broken. She could not see because her heart was full of darkness. I am helping her find the light again." Josiah stared at him, the boy's words a confusing mix of poetry and wisdom. But the blindness? Will she ever see again? Nahimana looked at him, his expression one of deep compassion. "I do not know," he said simply. "That is not for me to say. All I can do is help her spirit. The rest is up to her." The answer was not what Josiah wanted to hear. It was not the promise of a miracle. It was the truth, raw, honest, and filled with uncertainty. Josiah, for all his wealth and power, had to accept that he was not in control. He had to put his faith in something he could not see, something he could not touch. He had to trust a boy who had nothing but his beliefs and a few stolen herbs. It was a test of faith, and in that moment, Josiah realized he was standing at a crossroads. He could retreat to the safe world of logic and reason, or he could step into the unknown. He looked at Nahimana, and for the first time, he chose the latter. The test of faith, once accepted, brought a quiet calm to Josiah's heart. He stopped watching Nahimana with suspicion and began to observe him with a new kind of curiosity. He realized that the boy wasn't just a healer, he was a teacher. He was teaching Josiah a new language, the language of the land. Nahimana continued his work with Eleanor. He no longer needed to bring her physical objects to describe the world. He would simply sit with her, his presence a quiet, calming force, and he would describe the world around them. "The sun is warm on my skin," he said one morning, sitting on the porch with her. "It is a hand that touches the earth. It is a promise of a new day." Eleanor would close her eyes, her face tilted toward the sun, and she would listen. "I can feel its warmth," she said one day, her voice filled with wonder. "It's a beautiful touch." Nahimana's words had a profound effect on Josiah, too. He began to see the world around him not as a resource to be exploited, but as a living, breathing entity. He noticed the way the wind rustled the leaves on the cottonwood trees, a sound he had always ignored. He saw the intricate patterns on the rocks he had always kicked aside. He saw the way the stars looked at night, not as just a distant light, but as a map of the spirit world. The change in Josiah was subtle, but it was there. His perpetual scowl softened. The lines of worry on his face seemed to lessen. He started spending less time in his office and more time outside, simply existing on his own land. He would find Nahimana and Eleanor together, and would not interrupt, but would sit a small distance away, a silent student. The tension on the ranch had not completely dissipated, but it was different. Hank and his crew still grumbled, but they no longer challenged Josiah. His authority had been re-established, but this time it was based not on fear, but on a quiet, unshakable resolve. One evening, Josiah found Nahimana by the creek, kneeling in the shallows, his hands cupped in the water. Josiah approached, his boots making a soft, crunching sound on the pebbles. "What are you doing?" Josiah asked, his voice low. Nahimana looked up, his face illuminated by the soft light of the setting sun. "I am listening to the water," he said. "It tells me stories. It tells me of the journey it has taken. From the mountains to the sea, it tells me that a journey, even a long one, is always a return." The words resonated with Josiah. He had embarked on a journey to find a miracle, and in doing so, he had found something far more profound, a return to himself, a reconnection to the world he had spent his life trying to dominate. He sat on the bank beside the boy, his large, calloused hand dipping into the cool water. It was a simple gesture, but for Josiah, it was a profound act. He was no longer a master of the land. He was a part of it. He was learning to listen, not just with his ears, but with his heart. "You're a good boy, Nahimana," Josiah said, the words feeling clumsy but true. Nahimana did not respond with a word. He simply smiled, a rare and beautiful thing. He knew that the rancher's gratitude was not for the promise of a cure, but for the gift of a new perspective. The boy had not healed Eleanor's sight, but he was healing Josiah's blindness. And for the first time in a long time, Josiah felt a sense of peace that had nothing to do with his wealth or his power. He was simply a man, sitting by a creek, listening to the water, and he knew with a profound certainty that he was on the right path. The fragile peace on the Double Bar Ranch was shattered by the arrival of a man from Josiah's past. Elias Thorne, a rival rancher from a neighboring territory, rode up to the main house with a team of his men. Thorne was a tall, imposing figure with a reputation for being ruthless and calculating. He had always envied Josiah's success and had tried on multiple occasions to buy him out. "Josiah," Thorne boomed, dismounting his horse with a theatrical flourish. "It's been too long, my friend. I heard a strange rumor, and I had to come see it for myself." Josiah stepped out onto the porch, his hand resting on the hilt of the pistol he wore at his hip. "Thorne, what rumor are you talking about?" Thorne laughed, a loud, grating sound. "The one about the Apache boy. They say you've got a little savage living in your house, playing some kind of magic tricks on your wife." At that moment, Nahimana stepped out from the shadows of the parlor, his small, quiet figure standing next to Eleanor. Eleanor, hearing Thorn's voice, stood a little straighter, her hand finding Nahimana's for a moment of quiet solidarity. Thorn's smile vanished. His eyes, cold and sharp, raked over the boy. "Look at that. It's true. Josiah, have you lost your mind? The Apaches are nothing but thieves and killers. You're giving them a place in your home? They'll steal everything you own and then slit your throat in your sleep." The hostility in Thorn's voice was a physical blow, a harsh reminder of the world Josiah had tried to shut out. The words hung in the air, heavy and full of menace. "Get off my land, Thorn," Josiah said, his voice a low growl. "He is under my protection, and if you say another word against him, you'll be leaving in a pine box." Thorn's men shifted nervously, their hands on their guns. Thorn, however, was a predator, and he saw a weakness. "Easy, Josiah. I'm just looking out for you. Your foreman, Hank, told me all about it. He says you're being played for a fool." Josiah's gaze hardened. He knew Hank had been talking, but to hear it from Thorn was a profound betrayal. Thorn, seeing his advantage, pressed on. "I'll make you a deal. I'll take that boy off your hands. We'll teach him a lesson about who really owns this land, and I'll even offer you a fair price for your ranch. After all, a man who lets a child run his home can't be trusted with an empire." The words were a direct assault on Josiah's pride, his masculinity, his very way of life. They were a test not just of his loyalty to Nahimana, but of his new, fragile beliefs. The world he had come from was calling to him, demanding that he choose sides. He could go back to the man he was, a man of power and prejudice, or he could stand by the boy who had brought a flicker of light back into his world. Eleanor stepped forward, her sightless eyes fixed on the sound of Thorn's voice. Her hand was still in Nahimana's. "Mr. Thorn," she said, her voice clear and strong, "you have no business here. My husband knows what he is doing. This boy, he is a healer, and he is a friend." Her words, so simple and yet so powerful, were a shield against Thorn's cruelty. Thorn looked at her, then at Josiah, and a flicker of something, disbelief, rage, confusion, crossed his face. He had expected to see a broken woman, but he saw a woman of strength and resolve. Josiah's hand left his pistol. He took a step forward, a single, decisive movement. "You heard the lady, Thorn. Get out. Now. And don't ever set foot on my land again." Thorn saw the look in Josiah's eyes. It was not the look of a man who was afraid, but of a man who had nothing left to lose. He knew he had miscalculated. He had come here to humiliate Josiah, but in doing so, he had only solidified his rival's resolve. He gave a sharp nod to his men and mounted his horse. As Thorn and his men rode away, the dust they kicked up hung in the air, a final, lingering reminder of the conflict. Josiah stood on his porch, his hand resting on the rail. He looked at Eleanor, then at Nahimana, and finally he let out a long, slow breath. The danger was gone, but the lesson remained. He had faced down a man he had once considered a peer, and he had done so for a boy from a world he had long despised. In that moment, he knew his journey had only just begun. The true healing, the true change, was happening not in Eleanor's eyes, but in his own heart. The departure of Elias Thorn left a different kind of silence in its wake. It was not the heavy, despairing silence of Eleanor's blindness, but a tense, charged quiet, filled with a new understanding. Josiah had stood his ground, not just against a rival, but against his own ingrained prejudices. He had chosen to defend a young boy, and a woman's quiet dignity over the demands of a world he had always belonged to. That evening, the air on the ranch felt cleaner, the sunset more vibrant. The ranch hands, who had watched the confrontation from a distance, saw a new side of their boss. He was a man of his word, and he was not to be trifled with. For some, like Hank, the incident only deepened their resentment. But for others, like Silas, it fostered a quiet, budding respect. They saw a man who was willing to risk everything for the woman he loved, and the child who was trying to help her. Nahimana and Eleanor were a world unto themselves. They had their own language, a mix of quiet words, shared silences, and the subtle gestures of touch and presence. Nahimana would sit with her and describe the texture of a piece of bark, the warmth of a smooth stone, or the gentle breeze that stirred the leaves. He taught her to feel the world not through her eyes, but through her hands, her skin, her spirit. "The wind has many stories," he said one afternoon, as they sat on the porch. "It can whisper secrets through the grass, or it can roar with anger through the canyons. It is a breath and it is a voice." Eleanor tilted her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "I feel it," she whispered, her hands cupped as if to hold the wind. "It feels when free." Josiah watched them from the doorway, a silent observer. He had a sudden, profound realization. The boy wasn't trying to make Eleanor see with her eyes again. He was teaching her to see with her soul. And in doing so, he was giving her a new kind of sight, a deeper connection to the world around her that went beyond the physical. The boy's methods were not about magic or miracle cures. They were about patience, about grounding the spirit, about reminding a person of their place in the grand design of things. He was teaching Eleanor to find the light in the darkness, not by bringing the sun to her eyes, but by showing her the stars within herself. Josiah found himself captivated by their interactions. He saw the boy's gentle touch on Eleanor's hand, a touch that was not possessive but full of a quiet, respectful energy. He saw the way Eleanor's face would light up when Nahimana described a new sensation or a new sound. It was an intimacy that was 1,000 times more profound than the one he had shared with her before her blindness, an intimacy built on shared vulnerability and a deep, unspoken trust. One night, Josiah was walking through the ranch when he heard a quiet voice singing. It was Nahimana sitting alone by the creek, his back to the moonlight. He was singing in his native language, a low, melodic chant that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was a song of the land, of the water, of the stars. It was not a performance, but a prayer. Josiah stood in the shadows, listening. The song was hauntingly beautiful, filled with a sense of loss and reverence. It was the sound of a people who had been pushed aside, but who had not forgotten who they were. It was the sound of resilience, of a spirit that could not be broken. When the song ended, Josiah stepped out of the shadows. "That was a beautiful song," he said, his voice a little hoarse. Nahimana did not flinch. "It is a song for the water," he said. "It is a prayer to thank it for its journey. It is a song to remind us that we, too, are a journey." Josiah sat beside the boy, the two of them a study in contrasts, the gruff, world-weary rancher and the wise, quiet boy. "You have a gift, Nahimana," Josiah said, "not just for healing, for seeing." "We all have the gift of seeing," Nahimana replied, his gaze fixed on the stars. "We just forget to look." In that moment, under the vast, silent canvas of the western sky, Josiah understood. He had brought Nahimana to his ranch to heal his wife, but the boy's true purpose was to heal him. He was a guide, a silent teacher who was helping him see the world with a new heart, to find a connection to the land and the people on it that he had spent his life ignoring. The real healing had begun, not in a cure for blindness, but in the awakening of a spirit that had long been asleep. The quiet harmony that had settled over the ranch was disrupted by an unwelcome visitor from the past, a contingent of men from the U.S. Army cavalry. They rode in with the authority of the government, their uniforms crisp and their guns at the ready. Their leader, a stern-faced captain named Miller, dismounted and looked around the ranch with a look of suspicion. "Mr. Caldwell?" Miller asked, his voice sharp and official. "I'm Caldwell," Josiah replied, his hand instinctively going to his sidearm. "We have received intelligence that you are harboring a member of the Apache tribe," Miller stated, his eyes narrowing. "A minor, they say. We are here to retrieve him." Josiah felt a cold wave of dread. He had defended Nahimana against a rival rancher, but the army was a different matter. They represented the full, brutal force of the government's policy of subjugation and forced assimilation. "He's not being harbored," Josiah said, his voice dangerously low. "He is a guest, a friend." Miller scoffed. "A friend? Mr. Caldwell, we are in the middle of a war. The Apaches are our enemies. They raid our settlements, they steal our cattle. They are a constant threat to the peace of this territory. We are here to send him to a government-run boarding school where he can be taught to be a civilized American. The words civilized American hung in the air, a cruel irony. Josiah looked at the men, their faces grim and unyielding, and he felt a bitter rage building in his chest. They didn't see a boy. They saw a symbol of an entire people they were trying to erase. Nahimana, who had been sitting on the porch with Eleanor, stood up and walked down the steps. He looked at the soldiers, his face a mask of quiet dignity. He was not afraid. He was simply present. "I am not a threat," Nahimana said, his voice surprisingly clear. "I am here to help. I am a healer." Miller laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "A healer? Boy, you're a child. You belong in a school, not on a ranch full of white folk." "My grandfather taught me many things," Nahimana said, his eyes meeting Miller's. "He taught me that the earth is a healer. He taught me that the wind is a voice. And he taught me that a man with a closed heart cannot see the truth, no matter how much light is in the world." The words, so simple and yet so profound, struck Miller with a visible jolt. He was a man of logic and order, of rules and regulations. The boy's quiet wisdom was a direct challenge to his entire world-view. "You're coming with us," Miller said, his voice betraying a flicker of uncertainty. "That's an order." Josiah stepped in front of Nahimana, his body a shield. "He's not going anywhere," he said, his hand now on the butt of his pistol. "He's a guest in my home, and I will defend him with my life." The tension was palpable. The soldiers' hands went to their rifles. It was a standoff, the kind that had defined the West for generations. The powerful against the powerless. The government against the individual, a moment that could end in bloodshed. It was Eleanor sitting on the porch who broke the stalemate. "Captain Miller," she said, her voice soft but surprisingly commanding. "I am the one he is helping. Please, do not take him. He has given me more than any doctor ever could. He has given me my spirit back." Miller looked at the blind woman on the porch, her face filled with an ethereal calm. He saw the raw, fierce protection in Josiah's eyes. He saw the quiet dignity of the boy. He was a man of war, of orders, of a simple black and white world. But here, on this ranch, he was confronted with something he could not understand, a kind of loyalty that transcended policy and prejudice. After a long moment, Miller let out a slow, reluctant breath. He looked at Josiah, his eyes a mix of frustration and grudging respect. "This is not over, Caldwell," he said, his voice low. "The War Department is not going to forget about this." He gave a sharp command to his men, and they turned their horses and rode away, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the lingering feeling of a threat averted, for now. Josiah watched them go, his body trembling with a mixture of relief and adrenaline. He looked at Nahimana, then at Eleanor. He had faced down a rival and now a Federal Army unit, all for a boy he barely knew. He had stepped out of the world he had always belonged to and had taken his place in a new one, a world of loyalty, of courage, and of a quiet, profound faith. The cost was high, but the reward, he was starting to realize, was worth it. The confrontation with the cavalry had a profound effect on the ranch. The ranch hands, even Hank, were now more cautious around Nahimana. They had seen Josiah's unwavering loyalty, and they knew that challenging it was a line not to be crossed. For the first time, Nahimana was not just the Apache boy, but a person under Josiah's protection, a friend of the Caldwell family. In the aftermath of the standoff, Josiah felt a new closeness with Nahimana. The boy had stood his ground with a quiet dignity that Josiah had to admire. He had not pleaded or shown fear, he had simply stated his truth. One afternoon, Josiah found Nahimana in the fields, inspecting a cluster of herbs that grew near a small stream. Josiah approached him, his movements no longer guarded. "You weren't afraid," Josiah stated, more than asked. Nahimana looked up, his dark eyes meeting Josiah's. "Fear is a sickness," he said simply. "It makes the heart small. It makes the spirit blind." The words resonated deeply with Josiah. He had lived his life governed by fear, fear of failure, fear of loss, and a deep-seated fear of the unknown. He had built his empire on a foundation of control, but the boy's presence was showing him that true strength lay not in control, but in trust. "My grandfather told me a story," Nahimana said, his voice a quiet murmur. "He said that every person has a gift that is given to them by the Great Spirit. My gift is to see the truth in people's hearts. The soldiers, they were afraid. They were afraid of what they did not understand, and that fear made them blind." Josiah felt a sudden, profound curiosity. "And what about me, Nahimana? What do you see in my heart?" Nahimana paused, his gaze thoughtful. "I see a man with a strong heart," he said. "A heart that has been hurt. It is a heart that is full of sorrow for a loved one, and a heart that has forgotten how to be gentle." The words were a direct hit. They were not an accusation, but a simple, compassionate observation. Josiah, the powerful ranch owner, the man who had always been in charge, felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of vulnerability. This boy, this child of the desert, saw him in a way no one else ever had. He saw the cracks in his armor, the pain he had tried so hard to hide. "My grandfather also told me," Nahimana continued, his voice softer, "that a broken heart can be mended, but the person must be willing to do the mending." Josiah looked down at his hands, calloused and strong, but now feeling strangely weak. He had spent his life building, fixing, and conquering, but he had never learned how to heal. He had never learned how to mend a broken heart, not even his own. "How do you do it?" Josiah asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How do you heal a broken heart?" Nahimana picked up a small, smooth stone from the ground and placed it in Josiah's hand. "With a song," he said. "With a story. With a prayer. But most of all, say it with an open heart. A heart that is willing to accept the truth of its own pain. It is the beginning of all healing." Josiah held the stone, its cool smoothness a stark contrast to the rough texture of his hands. He looked at the boy, whose wisdom was as vast as the desert sky. A secret had been revealed, not just about Nahimana, but about Josiah himself. The boy was here not just to heal Eleanor, but to help Josiah find his way back to the man he was always meant to be, a man with a gentle heart, a man who could see the world not with his eyes, but with his soul. The days on the ranch began to take on a new, more hopeful rhythm. Nahimana's quiet, patient rituals with Eleanor continued, and with each passing day, she seemed to grow stronger, her spirit more vibrant. The darkness of her blindness remained, but it was no longer a total absence of light. It was a backdrop against which her internal world, her memories and her spirit shone with renewed brilliance. Nahimana began to introduce more complex healing practices. He would have Eleanor sit in a small circle of stones he had arranged, and he would chant in his native tongue, his voice a low melodic hum that vibrated through the air. The chants were not a demand for a cure, but a quiet, reverent plea to the natural world. "This is a song for the mountains," he explained to Josiah one day, as they watched from a distance. "It is a prayer to ask for their strength. The mountains stand tall and they do not move. They have seen everything and they are still strong. We ask for a little of their strength." Josiah watched, a new kind of respect growing in his heart. He saw the boy not as a miracle worker, but as a conduit. He was a bridge between the human world and the natural world, a reminder that they were all connected, a part of a larger living tapestry. The ranch hands, including Hank, still kept their distance, but their open hostility had been replaced by a grudging curiosity. They saw the change in Mrs. Caldwell, and they could not deny it. She was no longer a fragile, silent ghost. She was a woman of spirit, and they had to admit that the boy had something to do with it. One evening, Eleanor was sitting by the fire, her hands in her lap. Nahimana was sitting across from her, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. "Tell me about the stars again," Eleanor said, her voice soft and eager. Nahimana smiled. "The stars are the spirits of our ancestors," he said. "They are watching us. They are a reminder that we are never alone, and they are a promise of a new morning, even in the darkest night." As he spoke, a tear traced a path down Eleanor's cheek. But it was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of recognition, of connection, of a deep and profound sense of peace. It was then that it happened. A small, almost imperceptible flicker in the corner of her right eye. It was so small, so brief, that Josiah, who was watching from the doorway, thought he had imagined it. But then it happened again. A faint, fleeting glimpse of light. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her face. "Josiah?" she whispered, her voice filled with a profound shock. "Was that a light?" Josiah rushed to her side, his heart pounding in his chest. "I saw it too, my love. A flicker, just for a second." He looked at Nahimana, who was watching them, his face unreadable. He had not said anything, had not made any promises. He had simply done his work with a quiet, unwavering faith. "It's just a small part of the journey," Nahimana said, his voice a low, calming murmur. "The sun rises one small light at a time. The darkness does not disappear all at once. It takes patience, and it takes faith." The flicker of light was not a cure. It was a glimmer of hope. It was a sign that the boy's work was not just about healing the spirit, but that it might, in some miraculous way, also be healing the body. It was a promise that the darkness, which had seemed so permanent, might just be a temporary state. And in that moment, with the flicker of light on his wife's face, Josiah felt a wave of gratitude so profound it brought him to his knees. He looked at the boy, who was no longer just a healer, but a beacon of hope in a world that had become so very dark. The glimmer of hope, however small, was enough to ignite a fire in Josiah. He was filled with a new, almost frantic energy. He began to research, to look for any information on Apache healing, on the herbs Nahimana used, on the rituals he performed. He was a man of logic and reason, and he needed to understand this miracle. He wanted to understand it so that he could replicate it, so that he could make the light stay. His intensity, however, was not matched by Nahimana. The boy remained quiet and patient, continuing his daily rituals with a calm, unhurried rhythm. He was not a man of science or logic. He was a man of faith and of the earth. He did not seek to understand the miracle. He simply accepted it. This difference in approach led to the first real confrontation between them. One afternoon, Josiah found Nahimana in the parlor sitting with Eleanor. Nahimana had brought a handful of dried herbs and was preparing a poultice. "What is that?" Josiah demanded, his voice filled with a nervous urgency. "What is in it?" Nahimana looked up, his expression unreadable. "It is a mixture of sage and yarrow," he said simply. "It is for the skin. It cleanses and soothes." "And the last one? What was in that?" Josiah asked, his voice rising. "What about the chants? What do they mean? I need to understand. I need to know why it's working." Nahimana put down his herbs. "You ask too many questions, sir," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You ask with your mind. The healing does not come from the mind. It comes from the heart." "Don't give me your riddles, boy," Josiah snapped, his frustration boiling over. "I need to know. She saw a light. We have to make it happen again." Eleanor, who had been listening in silence, placed a gentle hand on Josiah's arm. "Josiah," she said, her voice a quiet plea, "you must have patience. He is doing what he can." But Josiah was beyond reason. "Patience? I have had 3 years of patience. I have had 3 years of watching you live in darkness. I can't just sit here and hope. I need to do something. I need to understand." Nahimana stood up, his small body radiating a quiet strength. "Your mind is like a fast river, sir," he said. "It is always moving. It is always looking for a way forward. But a fast river cannot hold the reflection of the sky. To see the sky, you must be still. You must be the lake." The words were a profound indictment of Josiah's entire way of life. He was a man of action, of relentless forward motion. He had built his life on it. And now this child was telling him that everything he was, everything he had worked for, was an obstacle to the very thing he wanted most, the healing of his wife. "You're just a child," Josiah said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and frustration. "What do you know about healing? You're a fake, a fraud." The words, once spoken by his enemies, now came from his own lips. They hung in the air, a bitter, corrosive poison. Nahimana's face remained impassive, but his eyes for the first time held a flicker of something, not fear, but a deep and profound sadness. He said nothing. He simply looked at Josiah, his gaze holding all the quiet, ancient wisdom that the rancher had so desperately needed and was now so foolishly throwing away. Nahimana turned and walked out of the parlor, leaving Josiah alone with his rage and his fear. Eleanor remained silent, her hand still resting on her husband's arm. "You were wrong, my love," she said, her voice a quiet, powerful truth. "He is not a fraud, he is a healer. And you, my dear Josiah, are the one who is blind." The words hit Josiah with a physical force. He looked at his wife, her sightless eyes filled with a clear, unwavering compassion. He had been so focused on curing her blindness that he had not seen his own. He was the one who was blind. He was the one who could not see the truth that was right in front of him. In his desperation, he had reverted to the man he was, a man of control and suspicion, and he had just driven away the one person who could truly help. The quiet of the ranch after Nahimana's departure was a different kind of silence. It was heavy, and it was filled with the crushing weight of Josiah's regret. He had let his fear and his old prejudices get the better of him, and he had wounded the very person who was trying to help him. He searched for Nahimana, but the boy was nowhere to be found. He checked the corrals, the stables, the fields. He called his name, but the only answer was the echo of his own voice. The boy had disappeared, a ghost in the vastness of the land he had come to heal. Josiah went back to the house, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He found Eleanor sitting in the parlor, her face a picture of serene sadness. "He's gone, Eleanor," Josiah said, his voice thick with shame. "I drove him away. I don't know what to do." "You must find him, Josiah," she said, her voice calm and steady. "He is not a child. He is a spirit of the earth. He will return when he is ready. But you must be ready too." Josiah had never been a man who apologized. His world was one of authority and command, but now in the face of his own failure, he knew he had to humble himself. He had to show Nahimana that he was not the man he had been, but the man he was trying to become. He waited for a day and then another. The light in Eleanor's eyes, the one small glimmer of hope, had vanished. The ranch felt like a tomb again. The ranch hands looked at him with a mix of pity and a quiet, knowing contempt. Hank and his crew were smug, their faces a clear message that they had been right all along. On the third day, Josiah went to the creek, the place where he had seen Nahimana and where the boy had shared his wisdom. He sat on the bank, his face in his hands, the weight of his guilt a physical burden. He was a man who had everything, and yet, in his arrogance, he had thrown away the one thing that truly mattered: hope. He had no words, no grand speeches. He simply sat there, a silent, broken figure in a world that he had once controlled. He waited. He waited for a sign, for a sound, for anything that would tell him the boy had not abandoned him forever. He didn't know how long he sat there. The sun set, painting the sky in a blaze of orange and purple. The stars began to appear one by one, a silent, eternal song. And then he heard it, the soft crunch of a moccasin on the pebbles. He looked up. Nahimana was standing on the other side of the creek, his small figure silhouetted against the moonlight. He said nothing. He just stood there, his presence a quiet, forgiving beacon. Josiah's voice was a low, rusty whisper. "Nahimana," he said, the name feeling like a prayer. I am sorry. I was a fool. I was blind." The boy did not respond with words. He simply sat down on his side of the creek. He dipped his hands into the cool water, and then he began to sing. It was the same song Josiah had heard before, the one for the water, the song of a journey, the song of a return. Josiah listened, his eyes closed. He heard not just a song, but an unspoken apology. The boy was not holding a grudge. He was simply waiting for Josiah to find his way back. He was reminding him that the river, no matter how fast or how angry, would eventually find its way home. When the song ended, Nahimana did not cross the creek. He simply stood up and walked away, back into the silent, watchful world he came from. But this time Josiah did not feel the pain of abandonment. he felt a profound sense of hope. The boy had not left him. He had simply given him the space to heal. He had given him a silent, powerful, and unwavering forgiveness. And in that moment, Josiah knew that the journey had just truly begun. The unspoken apology by the creek was a turning point. Josiah no longer saw Nahimana as a tool for a cure, but as a teacher. He had been humbled, and in his humility, he found a new sense of purpose. He realized that the boy's work was not a transaction. It was a sacred trust. He was not paying for a cure. He was being granted a chance at redemption. Nahimana returned to his daily routine, but the dynamic between him and Josiah had changed. The rancher no longer demanded answers or explanations. He simply watched and learned. He listened to the boy's quiet wisdom, and he began to see the world through a new lens. Nahimana taught him the names of the herbs and their uses. He taught him to read the signs of the weather in the clouds and the wind. He taught him to listen to the whispers of the land. He was an apprentice, a student of the earth, and his teacher was a child. One day, Nahimana brought a small thorny cactus to the house. He held it out to Eleanor. "This cactus," he said, his voice soft, "is a teacher. It has thorns to protect itself, but it holds water inside, a life-giving spirit." Eleanor, without hesitation, reached out and gently touched the thorns, not with fear, but with a quiet, understanding reverence. "It is a sign of strength," she said, her voice a whisper. "The thorns are not meant to hurt, but to protect." Josiah watched, a profound understanding dawning in his heart. The thorns were a metaphor. They were a reminder that some of the greatest gifts were hidden behind pain and difficulty. That evening, Josiah sat with Nahimana by the fire. "What is the true cost of this healing, Nahimana?" he asked, his voice low and serious. "The army, Thorn, my own men. They all see you as a threat, and they are all a threat to you. I am a rich man. I can pay you anything you want: gold, land, horses. What is the price for this healing?" Nahimana looked at him, his dark eyes filled with a deep, ancient wisdom. "The price is not in gold, sir," he said. "It is in your heart. You must learn to see with an open heart. You must learn to listen with an open mind. You must learn that you are not a master of the land, but a part of it. The price is to become a good man. The price is to learn to love the world, not just to own it." The words struck Josiah with a profound truth. He had spent his life accumulating wealth and power, believing that they were the measure of a man. But the boy was telling him that the true measure of a man was in his kindness, in his humility, in his ability to see the spirit in all things. Josiah looked at the fire, its flames dancing and swirling, and he saw a reflection of his own life. He had spent his life a solitary, unyielding flame, consuming everything around him. But now he was learning to be a part of a larger fire, a fire that warmed and nurtured, a fire that gave light without consuming. The true cost of the healing was not in money or in possessions. It was in the unlearning of a lifetime of prejudice and a rebirth of the soul. It was a price that was both immeasurable and priceless. And for the first time in his life, Josiah knew that he was willing to pay it. He was willing to give up everything he was to become the man he was always meant to be. The newfound peace and understanding on the ranch was once again threatened by the outside world. Elias Thorne returned, but this time he was not alone. He had brought with him 2 men, and one of them was the Army Captain Miller. Thorne had clearly been to the capital to pull some strings, and he was back with a powerful weapon, the full weight of the U.S. government. They rode in, their faces grim and determined. Thorne's triumphant sneer was a testament to his confidence. "I told you I'd be back, Caldwell," Thorne said, his voice dripping with condescension. "And this time I've brought the law." Miller dismounted, his face a mask of official authority. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth, "we have an order from the War Department. The Apache boy is to be surrendered to our custody for transport to a government school. Failure to comply will be considered an act of treason." The words were a hammer blow, an act of treason. The stakes had been raised. This was no longer just a standoff. It was a choice between his family and his country. Josiah stood on the porch, his hand on his sidearm. his body a silent shield for Eleanor and Nahimana. He looked at Thorn, then at Miller, and then at the boy, who stood quietly beside Eleanor. Nahimana was not afraid. He was simply waiting. He knew this moment would come. "He's not going anywhere," Josiah said, his voice a low, steady growl. "He is a guest in my home. He has done nothing wrong." "He is a member of an enemy tribe," Miller said, his voice rising in frustration. "He is a threat to our security. You are protecting a savage, Caldwell. This is not about right and wrong. This is about order." Thorn, seeing his moment, stepped forward. "I told you, Josiah, you're a fool. You're going to lose everything for a child who is nothing but a liability. Just give him up. You'll save yourself a lot of trouble." It was then that Eleanor spoke, her voice clear and strong. "Captain Miller," she said, her sightless eyes facing the soldiers. "This boy, he has done more for me than your entire government ever could. He has brought light back into my world." Miller looked at her, his face a mask of disbelief. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you're a blind woman. You can't possibly know what you're talking about." Eleanor smiled, a serene, powerful smile that seemed to radiate a light all its own. "Captain," she said, "my eyes may be blind, but my heart is not. And my heart sees a man who is a healer, and my heart sees a man who is a threat to that healing." Her words were a direct challenge to Miller's authority, and for a moment the captain was speechless. He was a man of war, of logic, of a black-and-white world, but he was now faced with a woman who spoke of a different kind of truth, a truth that could not be found in a government document or a military code. Thorn, seeing the standoff, lost his patience. "Just take him," he bellowed. "I'll handle Caldwell." He moved to grab Nahimana. Josiah, with a speed that belied his age, pulled his pistol and pointed it directly at Thorn's head. "Don't you touch him," he said, his voice flat and deadly. "I swear to God, if you take one more step, I will put a bullet through your skull." The air was thick with tension. The soldiers' hands went to their rifles. The standoff was a powder keg, and any small movement could ignite it. Josiah, who had always been a man of control, was now a man of righteous fury. He was no longer a rancher protecting his property. He was a father protecting his son. The cost of this healing, the boy had said, was to become a good man. And in that moment, Josiah was the best man he had ever been. The standoff on the porch was a silent, brutal battle of wills. Josiah, his pistol aimed at Thorn's head, was an unyielding wall of fury and protection. Captain Miller, a man of rules and protocol, was caught between his orders and the powerful, unscientific truth of what he was witnessing. Thorn, for all his bluster, was a coward. He stared down the barrel of Josiah's pistol, and he saw a look in the rancher's eyes that he had never seen before, a cold, determined willingness to kill. Thorn's bravado melted away, replaced by a cold, animal fear. "He's not worth it, Caldwell," Thorn stammered, his face pale. "You'll go to jail for treason." "I would rather go to hell than hand this boy over to you," Josiah said, his voice a low, unwavering promise. Miller, seeing that the situation was on the verge of turning to bloodshed, intervened. "Caldwell, stand down," he commanded, his voice filled with a desperate urgency. "We can talk about this. No one needs to get hurt." Josiah did not lower his pistol. His gaze remained fixed on Thorn. It was Nahimana who broke the stalemate. He stepped forward out from behind Eleanor, his small hand reaching for Josiah's arm. "Put the gun down, sir," he said, his voice a quiet, calming murmur. "Do not let their anger become your own." Josiah looked at him, his finger still on the trigger. The boy's face was a picture of serene acceptance. He was willing to sacrifice himself to save Josiah from his own anger. Josiah's hand trembled. He had to make an impossible choice. He could fight and possibly kill for the boy, and risk going to jail and losing his ranch. Or he could surrender and betray the very trust he had just earned. He could not and would not make that choice. But Nahimana had already made it for him. He took another step forward, his hands open and his head held high. "I will go with you, Captain," he said to Miller, "if that is what is needed to bring peace." Eleanor gasped. "No, Nahimana," she cried. Josiah's face was a mask of shock and rage. "You can't," he yelled. "They'll send you away. They'll destroy you." Nahimana looked at him, his gaze filled with a profound understanding. "A part of me will always be here," he said, his voice a soft, final whisper. "I have taught you what you needed to know. The rest, you must do yourself." He turned and walked toward the soldiers. Thorne watched, a look of triumph on his face. Miller, his face a mixture of relief and a strange, grudging respect, nodded to his men. One of them dismounted and took Nahimana's arm. "Wait!" Josiah cried, his voice breaking. He had let go of his pistol. He had made the wrong choice, and now it was too late. He had betrayed the boy who had taught him to see. He watched in horror as they led the boy to a horse, his small, dignified figure swallowed up by the soldiers. As they rode away, Nahimana did not look back. He simply rode on, a quiet, brave warrior in a world that had no place for his kind of wisdom. Josiah stood on his porch, his hand empty, his heart filled with a terrible, crushing guilt. He had learned the true cost of healing, and it was his own faith. He had failed the ultimate test. He had stood strong against a rival, but he had surrendered to a system he could not defeat. He had lost the boy, and in doing so, he had lost a part of himself. And as he watched the dust from their horses disappear into the distance, he knew with a terrible certainty that this was a mistake he would never be able to forgive himself for. The light that had just begun to flicker was now gone, and the darkness this time was a choice he had made himself. The dust from the soldiers' horses had long settled, but a new, heavier dust now choked the air on the Double Bar Ranch, the dust of profound, crushing defeat. Josiah stood on his porch, his hand empty, the ghost of his pistol a heavy weight. He had faced down a rival, a man of greed and malice, only to surrender to a force he could not comprehend, the cold, unyielding power of a system that saw a child not as a person, but as a problem to be solved. He had let Nahimana walk away, believing that the boy's sacrifice was the only way to prevent bloodshed. But in that moment of quiet, terrible surrender, Josiah had betrayed the very foundation of his new self. He had chosen the path of least resistance, a choice that now burned in his soul like a brand. The ranch, once a symbol of his hard-won success, now felt like a prison. He walked through its grounds, the silent, watchful eyes of his men following him. Hank, the foreman, no longer had to whisper his contempt. It was etched on his face in a mask of knowing superiority. He had been right all along. The Apache boy was a mistake, and Josiah, in his foolishness, had nearly lost everything. But the ranch's physical landscape was nothing compared to the desolation within the main house. Eleanor was a ghost again, a silent statue in her parlor chair. The flicker of light, the brief glimpse of hope she had experienced, was gone. The darkness had returned, not just in her eyes, but in her spirit. She was not angry with Josiah. Her sadness was far deeper than that. It was the sadness of a person who had been shown a beautiful, fragile possibility, only to have it snatched away. She had returned to the silence of her world, and this time the silence was an accusation. Josiah found himself consumed by a crippling guilt. He saw Nahimana in every shadow, heard his voice in every gust of wind. The boy's words, his quiet wisdom, now haunted him. The price is to become a good man. Josiah had failed. He was a rich man, a powerful man, a man who had faced down an army. But he was not a good man. He spent the next few days in a fog of despair, his mind racing with a single unyielding thought. He had to get Nahimana back. He had to redeem himself. He had to prove to Eleanor, to himself, and to the boy that his surrender was not the end of the story. He went to the stables and saddled his favorite horse, a strong bay mare he called Justice. He gathered supplies, enough for a long journey. He did not tell anyone where he was going. He simply rode out, leaving his vast empire behind for a desperate, singular quest. His destination was the army's main garrison, located several days' ride away. He knew it would be a fool's errand. They would not simply hand the boy over. They would laugh in his face, arrest him, or worse. But he no longer cared about logic or reason. He was no longer a man of business and strategy. He was a man driven by a single, desperate need to right a wrong. The journey was a crucible. The sun was a hammer, the dust a constant companion. He rode for days, his mind a whirlwind of memories. He thought of Eleanor, of her quiet suffering, of the brief, beautiful smile that had returned to her face when Nahimana was there. He thought of the boy, of his unwavering dignity, of his simple, profound truth. He had taken all of that for granted, believing it was something he could own, something he could control. He was a man who had always taken what he wanted. He had taken this land from the cattlemen before him. He had taken his place in a new world, but with Nahimana he had been offered a gift, and in his arrogance he had rejected it. The road was long, and it was unforgiving. He rode through canyons that whispered of old battles and across plains that stretched to a silent, indifferent horizon. And with every mile, the weight of his guilt began to transform into something else, a fierce, burning resolve. He was no longer just seeking redemption for himself. He was fighting for the very soul of the land he had claimed. He was fighting for a different kind of justice, a justice that was not based on laws or government orders, but on the simple, universal truth of one human heart reaching out to another. The road ahead was long and the odds were impossible, but for the first time in a long time, Josiah Caldwell was not just a powerful rancher. He was a man with a purpose. He was on the road to redemption, and there was no turning back. Josiah arrived at the Fort Apache garrison under a sweltering sun, the air thick with the smell of dust and wood smoke. The fort was a hive of military activity, with soldiers and horses moving in a choreographed dance of power and control. He was immediately met with suspicion. His powerful build and the fine quality of his horse marked him as a man of means, but his disheveled appearance and desperate eyes did not fit the profile of a typical rancher. He was taken to the captain's office, a small Spartan room dominated by a large desk, and a portrait of a stern-faced general. Captain Miller sat behind the desk, his face a mask of weariness and quiet frustration. He looked up, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Caldwell," he said, his voice flat. "I didn't expect to see you here. I told you there's nothing more to be done." "I'm not here for a lecture, Captain," Josiah said, his voice raw with exhaustion and resolve. "I'm here for the boy. I want him back." Miller scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. "You're a fool, Caldwell. He's a prisoner of the state. He's a ward of the government. He's on his way to a boarding school in Pennsylvania." "You can't do that." Josiah's voice rose, filled with a frantic desperation. "He's not an enemy. He's a child. He's a healer." "He's a symbol, Caldwell," Miller said, his voice dropping to a low, weary tone. "He's a part of a problem we are trying to solve. Assimilation. It's the policy. It's the law." He leaned forward, his voice a low, confidential whisper. "Look, I admire what you tried to do. I saw the way your wife looked at him. I saw the way you looked at him. But this is bigger than you. This is about a way of life." Josiah felt a cold fury building in his chest. "A way of life that is nothing but lies and arrogance," he snarled. "That boy has more dignity and honor in his little finger than your entire army. You're not civilizing him. You're destroying him." Miller's face hardened. He stood up, his posture rigid. "You're on federal property, Caldwell. I could have you arrested for inciting a riot. I'm going to ask you one last time. Leave, now, or I will have you removed." Josiah knew he was beaten. He had come here a lone man against an entire system, and he had failed. He turned and walked out of the office, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He had lost. He had lost the boy, and he had lost the last shred of his own self-respect. He was walking toward his horse when a voice stopped him. "Mr. Caldwell?" It was Silas, the young ranch hand, standing in the shadows of a supply tent. Josiah turned, a look of surprise on his face. "Silas, what are you doing here?" I couldn't just stand there and watch, sir," Silas said, his voice a nervous whisper. "After you left, Mrs. Caldwell, she just went back into her darkness. It was like watching a flame die. I saw how much he helped her. I couldn't let it go." He looked around nervously, and then lowered his voice even further. "I've been trying to find out where they sent him. I've been talking to some of the men who were on the escort." Josiah's heart leaped in his chest, a flicker of hope, the first he had felt in days ignited in his soul. "You found out?" "I heard them talking," Silas said. "They're not sending him straight to Pennsylvania. They're taking him to a transfer station first. A holding camp a few days' ride from here near the old trading post. They're going to hold a small group of boys there before they send them on the train. I heard the train leaves in a few days. The information was a lifeline. It was a second chance, a fragile thread of possibility in a world that had become so bleak. Josiah looked at the young man, his face a study in quiet, determined loyalty. Silas was not a hero. He was not a warrior. He was just a young man who had seen an injustice and had decided in his own small way to do something about it. "Why, Silas?" Josiah asked, his voice raw with a newfound gratitude. "Why did you do this?" Silas looked him in the eye, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Because he's not a savage, sir. He's a healer. He brought the light back to your wife's face, and you defended him. You were the only one who did. You're a good man, Mr. Caldwell, and I believe in good men." The words hit Josiah with a profound emotional force. He had believed he had failed, that he had lost everything, but in his moment of failure, he had gained an unlikely ally. He had found an honor and a loyalty that had nothing to do with money or power. He had found a new kind of friendship, a partnership forged in the crucible of a shared belief. The road to redemption was long and treacherous, but now he was not alone. He had an ally, and with Silas by his side, he knew he was willing to face any obstacle. With Silas's information, the despair that had consumed Josiah was replaced by a frantic, single-minded urgency. The holding camp was a small window of opportunity, a chance to get to Nahimana before he was lost forever. The two of them, the grizzled rancher and the young farmhand, became an unlikely team, a silent, determined force against a system that was both vast and unyielding. They rode out of Fort Apache under the cover of night, their horses a blur in the moonlight. They traveled light and fast, skirting the main roads and following old cattle trails that only Josiah, with his years of experience, knew. Silas, for his part, was an invaluable companion. He was quiet and observant, a man of simple words but of profound conviction. As they rode, Josiah found himself talking not just of his plan, but of his journey. He told Silas about Eleanor, about her quiet suffering, and about the small, beautiful miracle that Nahimana had brought to their lives. He talked about his own blindness, his own arrogance, and his failure to protect the boy. It was a confession, a soul-bearing that he had never done before. He had always been a man who kept his emotions locked away. But now, in the face of this desperate mission, the walls he had built were crumbling. Silas listened, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight, and when Josiah was done, he simply nodded. "We'll get him back, sir," he said, his voice filled with a quiet certainty that was more reassuring than any promise. The journey was a race against time. They rode for 2 days, pushing their horses to their limits. They ate and slept little, their minds focused on a singular goal: to reach the holding camp before the train arrived. The camp was a desolate collection of canvas tents and a single wooden barracks, a bleak outpost in the middle of nowhere. A group of soldiers, weary and bored, guarded the perimeter. In the center of the camp, a large canvas tent was secured with a heavy chain and padlock. "That's it," Silas whispered, his voice low and tight. "That's where they're keeping them." Josiah looked at the tent, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw the small, slight figures of children huddled inside. He knew Nahimana was in there, a healer trapped in a world that saw him as nothing more than a problem. They needed a plan. They couldn't simply ride in and demand the boy back. The soldiers would kill them. They had to be smart. They had to be silent. "We wait for nightfall," Josiah whispered. "We'll need to distract them." Silas nodded, his eyes scanning the camp. "I'll create a diversion, sir," he said, his voice filled with a newfound courage. "I'll set fire to the supply tent on the other side. When they rush to put out the fire, you go in, you find Nahimana, and you get out." The plan was reckless, but it was their only option. It was a testament to how far they had come, from 2 strangers on a ranch to 2 men willing to risk their lives for a single, shared purpose. As darkness fell, the camp settled into a quiet rhythm. The soldiers sat around a fire, drinking coffee and playing cards. The air was filled with a sense of monotonous security. It was the perfect time to strike. Silas gave Josiah a grim nod and slipped away into the darkness, a small torch in his hand. Josiah watched him go, a profound sense of respect and gratitude filling his heart. He was no longer a man of authority, but a man of faith. He was putting his life in the hands of a young man he had once dismissed as a nuisance. Moments later, a shout echoed from the other side of the camp. "Fire!" A small flickering light erupted into a brilliant, angry blaze. The soldiers sprang to action, grabbing buckets and running toward the fire. The camp was a chaos of shouts and hurried movement. Josiah saw his chance. He crept toward the tent, his body low to the ground, his mind focused on a singular purpose. He reached the tent, his heart pounding against his ribs. He unclasped the padlock, his hands trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. He lifted the flap and slipped inside, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear. In the dim light, he saw them, a group of young boys huddled in the corner, their faces a picture of silent, defeated despair. And then he saw him. Nahimana was sitting in the middle of the group, his head held high, his hands clasped in his lap. He was not crying. He was not afraid. He was simply waiting. He was the eye of a storm, a quiet point of light in a world of darkness. "Nahimana," Josiah whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of relief and regret. "We're here. We're getting you out." Nahimana looked at him, his dark eyes filled with a profound understanding. He had known Josiah would come. He had not lost his faith. And in that moment, Josiah knew that the greatest gift he could ever give the boy was not his freedom. It was the knowledge that he had returned. The road to redemption was long and treacherous, but he was here. He was not too late. The escape from the holding camp was a blur of hurried movements and silent tension. Josiah led Nahimana out of the tent, and together they slipped into the chaos of the fire. The soldiers were still scrambling, their attention focused on the blaze that Silas had so expertly ignited. As they neared the edge of the camp, a shout rang out. A soldier, a young, nervous-looking man, had spotted them. "Hey! Stop!" Josiah grabbed Nahimana's hand and they began to run, the sound of the soldiers' footsteps thudding behind them. They burst into the darkness, a small, fleeing shadow against the vast, indifferent landscape. They reached the horses, which Silas had tethered a safe distance from the camp. Silas was there, his face a grim mask of relief. "I'll go with you, sir," he said, his hand on his own horse. "No," Josiah said, his voice firm. "You've done enough. Go back to the ranch. Tell Eleanor. I'll take him from here. God bless you, son." Silas nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "God bless you too, Mr. Caldwell. And Godspeed." Josiah mounted Justice, and with a swift, expert movement, pulled Nahimana up in front of him. They rode off into the night, leaving the burning camp and the shouting soldiers behind them. The journey was long and arduous. They rode for a day and a night, stopping only to rest the horses and to eat a few bites of dried jerky. Nahimana was a silent, uncomplaining passenger. He did not speak. He did not ask questions. He simply trusted. His trust was a quiet, powerful force. It was a constant reminder to Josiah of what he was fighting for. He was fighting for this boy, for this quiet, profound faith that he had been shown. He was fighting for a chance to prove that a man could change, that a heart could be healed, that a soul could be redeemed. They were a day away from the ranch when the unexpected happened. As they rode through a deep canyon, the air suddenly filled with the sound of a gunshot. A bullet whizzed past Josiah's head, and he instinctively ducked, pulling Nahimana close. "Down!" he yelled, his voice a low, urgent warning. He looked up and saw them. 3 men on horseback, their faces grim and determined. They were from Fort Apache, a small, highly trained group of scouts and soldiers who had been sent to track them down. Their leader was a man with a cold, calculating look in his eyes. He was not interested in talking. He was interested in one thing: capturing the boy and punishing the man who had defied the law. Josiah spurred his horse forward, but they were no match for the scouts. They were faster, more agile, and they were hunting with a cold professional determination. Another gunshot rang out, and Justice cried out, a high, piercing whinny of pain. The horse stumbled and fell, and Josiah and Nahimana were thrown to the ground, a tangled heap of arms and legs. Josiah was up in an instant, his body a shield over the boy. "Run, Nahimana!" he yelled. "Run, go!" Nahimana did not run. He looked at Josiah, his face filled with a quiet, heartbreaking resolve. "No," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I will not leave you. You came for me. We will face this together." The scouts were upon them now, their faces grim and unyielding. The leader dismounted and looked down at them, a sneer on his face. "So, you thought you could outsmart the army, Caldwell? You're a fool, and now you're a traitor." Josiah stood up, his body trembling with a mixture of pain and rage. He was beaten. He had risked everything, and he had lost. He had not only failed to save Nahimana, but he had also sealed his own fate. He would be arrested, imprisoned, and his ranch would be gone forever. It was a cold, bitter defeat. He had tried to do the right thing, and he had failed. The world had proven to him that it had no place for good men. It only had a place for power and for the law. And in his moment of failure, the pain was not just in his body, but in his soul. The light he had fought so hard to bring back was now gone, and this time, it was gone forever. The moment of defeat was absolute. Josiah stood bruised and battered, his body a shield over Nahimana, as the scouts surrounded them. He was a man who had everything, and now he had nothing. He had lost his ranch, his freedom, and the last shred of his dignity. He had fought a system he could not defeat, and he had paid the ultimate price. "Get up, Caldwell," the scout leader said, his voice cold and flat. "You're under arrest. And the boy, well, he's just a part of the evidence." Josiah did not move. He was a man of action, but he was also a man who knew when the fight was lost. He had no more tricks, no more allies. He was just a man and a boy, standing alone against the might of an army. It was then that it happened. A sound, low and rhythmic, began to fill the air, the sound of hoofbeats, dozens of them. The scouts, their attention fixed on Josiah, did not hear them at first, but the sound grew louder, more insistent, a thunderous roar in the silent canyon. The scout leader looked up, a look of confusion on his face. "What is that?" And then they saw them. A cloud of dust on the horizon, a swirling, roiling mass that grew larger with every passing second. And from the dust emerged a sight that sent a wave of shock through the scouts. A group of men on horseback, their faces grim and determined. They were the ranch hands from the Double Bar, led by none other than Hank, the foreman. The scouts, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, stared in stunned disbelief. Hank rode to the front of the group, his face a mask of resolute fury. "You're not taking him," Hank said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The scout leader scoffed. "And who are you?" "You're just a bunch of dirt-poor ranch hands. We're the U.S. Army, we are the law." "The law has its place," Hank said, his gaze unwavering. "But sometimes a man has to choose. And we've chosen. We're choosing to stand by a good man. You're not taking him. You're not taking the boy. You're not taking anyone." The scout leader's face went from shock to pure, unadulterated rage. He was a man of rules, a man of order. This was chaos. This was a challenge he could not accept. "If you try to stop us, we will kill you," he said, his hand on his pistol. "Then kill us," Hank said, his voice filled with a quiet, unshakable courage. "But if you do, the story will be told. The story of a brave boy, a good man, and an army that would not let them be free. And you'll have to live with that story." The standoff was a moment of profound, breathtaking irony. The very men who had despised Nahimana, who had mocked Josiah for his choice, were now here, risking their lives for both of them. Hank, who had been the embodiment of a lifetime of prejudice, was now the voice of a new, unforeseen kind of justice. The scout leader looked at the group of ranch hands, their faces filled with a quiet, determined defiance. He saw the unyielding resolve in their eyes. He knew that if he fought, he would lose. He was a man of war, but he was also a man who understood a lost cause. He gave a sharp command to his men, and with a collective sigh of frustration, they turned and rode away, leaving behind a silence that was a testament to the power of a single act of courage. Josiah, who had been on his knees, looked at Hank, his face a mixture of shock and profound gratitude. "Hank, why?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Hank, for the first time in his life, looked at his boss not with contempt but with respect. "We saw it, sir," he said, his voice low. "We saw how you fought for that boy. We saw you give up everything you had for him. We saw you become a good man, and we wanted to stand with you." Josiah looked at his men, his family, a group of hard-bitten ranch hands who had come to his aid when he needed them most. They had chosen him. They had chosen to stand with him against the law, against the government, against the very world they had always known. He had lost everything, but in doing so, he had gained something far more valuable, a loyalty that was forged not in power, but in a shared, unshakable belief. The journey home was a quiet, triumphant return. They were no longer just men on a ranch. They were a family. They were a tribe. And they were coming home, a group of unlikely heroes, a testament to the unforeseen light that can shine even in the darkest of times. The return to the Double Bar Ranch was a quiet, triumphant procession. The ranch hands, a silent, watchful escort, rode beside Josiah and Nahimana, their faces a mixture of pride and a quiet, newfound respect. The defeat and despair of the past few days were gone, replaced by a sense of quiet hope and a deep, unshakable peace. As they rode into the ranch yard, the first person they saw was Eleanor. She was standing on the porch, a silent sentinel, her hands clasped in front of her. Silas, true to his word, had returned and told her the story. She had been waiting for them, a woman of quiet, profound faith. Nahimana slid off the horse and walked toward her. He did not speak. He simply stood in front of her, his small body a beacon of light in her darkness. Eleanor, her face a picture of pure, unadulterated relief, reached out and gently touched his face. "You're back," she whispered, a tear of pure joy tracing a path down her cheek. "I knew you would be back." Josiah watched, his heart full to bursting. He had given up everything to save this boy, and in doing so he had saved himself. He had chosen to be a good man, and in that choice he had found a loyalty and a love that was more powerful than any law, more valuable than any empire. Over the next few weeks, the ranch settled into a new, more peaceful rhythm. Nahimana resumed his daily rituals with Eleanor, but this time the atmosphere was different. The rituals were no longer a desperate plea for a cure, but a quiet, patient journey of healing. The ranch hands, even Hank, now participated. They brought him herbs from the fields, smooth stones from the creek. They listened to his quiet wisdom, and they learned to see the world with a new heart. The ranch itself began to transform. It was no longer just a business. It was a home. It was a community. It was a place where a man who had built a life on power was learning to build a life on love. The flicker of light that Eleanor had experienced before Nahimana's capture returned, and this time it was stronger. It was not a magical, sudden return of sight. It was a slow, gradual awakening, a small, persistent glimmer in the corner of her right eye. It was not a cure, not yet, but it was a promise. It was a sign that the body, like the spirit, could be healed. One evening, Josiah found Nahimana and Eleanor in the parlor. Nahimana was sitting with her, his hand resting gently on hers. Eleanor was telling a story, her voice filled with a quiet, beautiful joy. "And then," she said, a small smile playing on her lips, "the colors, they came back. Not all at once, but just a little. A little bit of blue, like a summer sky, and a little bit of green, like the leaves on a tree." Josiah watched her, his eyes filled with a new kind of light, the light of a man who was no longer blind. He looked at Nahimana, who was watching Eleanor, his face a picture of quiet, profound satisfaction. "You did it," Josiah whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave her back her sight." Nahimana looked at him, his dark eyes filled with a gentle wisdom. "I did not give her back her sight, sir," he said, his voice a quiet murmur. "I only showed her where to find the light. The rest was her." The words were a final, profound lesson. The healing had not come from Nahimana's magic or from a secret ritual. It had come from Eleanor's own spirit, from her own willingness to see. The boy had not been a miracle worker. He had been a guide, a teacher, a friend who had shown them the way back to themselves. The journey had not been about a cure for blindness. It had been about a cure for the human spirit. It had been about a man who had learned to be a good man, a community that had learned to be a family, and a family that had learned to be a tribe. The healing was not just in Eleanor's eyes. It was in all of them. It was in the land, in the wind, in the stars. It was a quiet, powerful, and eternal truth. The final chapter of the story was not an ending, but a new beginning. The Double Bar Ranch was no longer just a piece of land. It was a home, a community, a sanctuary. The events of the past few weeks had transformed it from a monument to a man's ambition into a testament to a family's resilience. Josiah, once the gruff, solitary ranch owner, was now a man of quiet, profound purpose. He had found a new kind of strength, one that was not measured in dollars or in power, but in love and in loyalty. He was no longer a man who took from the land. He was a man who belonged to it. He spent his days not in his office but in the fields, listening to the wind and the whispers of the earth, a student of the same teacher who had healed his wife. Nahimana remained on the ranch, not as a guest or a healer, but as a part of the family. He had found a new home, a new tribe, in a world that had once been his enemy. He continued his work with Eleanor, his quiet, patient rituals, a daily reminder of the power of a shared spirit. Eleanor's sight, a small persistent glimmer, was a constant source of wonder. She could now see shadows and shapes, the outlines of her husband's face, the soft glow of the fire. The doctors had said there was no hope, but they had not seen the truth that Nahimana had shown her, that the light was always there, waiting to be found. The ranch hands, a motley crew of hard-bitten men, were now a family. They had stood with their boss against an army, and in that act of defiance they had found a new kind of honor. They no longer saw the boy as a threat, but as a quiet, powerful force for good. They had seen his courage, his dignity, and his unwavering faith, and they had been changed by it. The final scene of the story took place on a high ridge overlooking the ranch. Josiah and Nahimana stood together, a silent, solitary pair, their faces illuminated by the setting sun. "It is a beautiful world, sir," Nahimana said, his voice a quiet murmur. "It is," Josiah agreed, his gaze sweeping over the vast, expansive landscape. He saw not just his ranch, but a living, breathing testament to the power of a single act of kindness, a single act of courage, a single act of love. "My grandfather told me," Nahimana said, his eyes on the horizon, "that a man's life is a journey, and every journey, no matter how long, is a return to a new home, a new beginning." Josiah looked at him, his heart full. He had started his journey as a man who had everything, and he had returned as a man who had nothing, but who had gained everything. He had learned that the truest wealth was not in gold or in land, but in the people you loved, the courage you showed and the forgiveness you gave. He had learned that the greatest battle was not with an enemy, but with your own fear and your own prejudice. And he had learned that the most profound healing was not a cure for blindness, but an awakening of the heart. The sun set in a blaze of glory, painting the sky with a promise of a new morning. The darkness was not gone, but it was no longer a threat. It was a part of the journey. And Josiah, a man who had once been so afraid of the unknown, was now ready to face it. He was ready to face the new horizon, a man of faith, a man of courage, a man who had finally learned to see. The story of a rich rancher, a blind wife, and a quiet, courageous Apache boy had come to an end, but their journey had just begun.